If the money, thought, time, and energy now being poured uselessly into the development of rocket propulsion were invested in a basic study of gravity, it's likely we could have an effective and economical space travel at a small fraction of the cost within a decade. This was written by Townsend Brown in 1955, 30 years after he invented anti-gravity. So if this is true, and there is anti-gravity, where are all the flying cars? Where are the propulsionless vehicles? Well, many suspect they are here, except they're not cars. They're the unidentified aerial phenomena being recorded at military bases. And they're the evolution of Townsend's work being developed in secrecy by the government for decades. Today, we're going to learn about the life of Thomas Townsend Brown with our guest, Paul Shatzkin. He's the author of The Man Who Mastered Gravity. Now let's hear from Paul.
Okay, let's go.
The journey that I have been on, and we're going to talk about the second half of it, but the journey started with things that I learned about Philo Farnsworth in the 1970s. So we can talk about that progression and then talk about Brown, but it's interesting how one thing led to another. And I do think that in some ways they are tied together. But then we're going out into the future.
Yeah, and I love the story because the ionic air breeze purifier might be the most mundane, boring invention that Sharper Image has ever made. And somehow it relates to UFOs, quantum mechanics, and government conspiracy to control gravity.
Yeah.
So that makes me think, what else are we overlooking at the Sharper Image? You know, maybe the Tempur-Pedic pillow has a gateway to another dimension.
Well, it does, because arguably when we go to sleep and start dreaming, our dreams come from somewhere unknown to us, and maybe that's some interconnected place in the quantum realm.
Yeah, I just did an interview about Tesla about a month ago, and he really seemed to believe that. He thought that these ideas were out there and chose the right person. So it's interesting.
Yeah, I think that that is arguable. I don't dispute that contention. There are, what did Shakespeare say? There are more things in our philosophy, or more things in heaven and earth than are known in our philosophy, Horatio. Something like that. I might be getting my Shakespeare's mixed up there, but yeah.
So take us back. How did you get into writing to begin with? Because did you go to school for this?
No, not at all. I haven't gone to school for any of this.
Maybe that's why you're good at it.
That's what I like to think. One of my favorite lines that I picked up in this whole journey is a quotation from Cliff Gardner, who was the glass blower who fabricated the very first television camera tubes in the 1920s. And in 1930, he showed somebody how he made that camera tube. And the person he was showing it to was very impressed with the techniques and said, well, this is very interesting because my people told me this could not be done. And Cliff Gardner said, well, we didn't know it couldn't be done, so we just went ahead and did it. Yeah. So not knowing what can't be done kind of leaves the field open to exploring possibilities that we might not otherwise be cognizant of.
It's like ignorance is bliss, right?
Well, let's not go that far.
Yeah. Well, so
but to your point, there is a point at which orthodoxy becomes a very constraining mechanism. And invariably, historically, advances are made by things that live outside the orthodoxy. Progress always comes in from the fringe and is usually, as Schopenhauer put it, and this is one of the quotations in the Farnsworth book, the truth always goes through three phases. First, it is ridiculed, then it is opposed and often violently, and then in the third stage, it's recognized as having been self-evident all along. So somewhere in there is the voice of the orthodoxy resisting the change that's always coming in from the periphery.
What point in your life were you at when you decided I'm going to write about this Philo Farnsworth?
Well, when it became a writing kind of obsession was in the mid 1970s, and the motivation there was when I told a colleague I was working in Hollywood, working on TV shows at the time, in the tech field behind the scenes, and said to somebody that Philo T. Farnsworth was the father of television, and he had never heard that name. And when I began to tell him what little I knew of the story, he said, well, that would make a great movie for television. And I, at the time, had aspirations of moving to a different point in a career and being a producer of television material. And so that was kind of the point of initiation where we began to track down the material. Now, I first learned of Philo Farnsworth that summer of 1973. As I was graduating from college, I read this publication. It's called Radical Software. And when I was going to school in the early 70s, I'm much older than I look. But when I was going to school in the early 70s, I was part of what we called the guerrilla video movement, which was kind of the early stages of personal use of electronic media. We used the very first, the people in this movement, we were kind of carryovers from the idealism of the 1960s and thought that we could use the very first portable video technology with cable TV as a community organizing medium. And the publication that organized a lot of that effort was this publication called Radical Software. And they published an issue from San Francisco in the spring and summer of 1973 called the Video City Edition because, as I learned in its pages, San Francisco, it was published from San Francisco rather than New York. I left that detail out. But it was called the Video City Edition from San Francisco because San Francisco is where video was invented in the 1920s. And as I'm going through the pages of this magazine, I saw, where are they now? Here we go. Pictures of what I would call the prehistory of television that I had never seen before. And that's where I heard the name of Philo T. Farnsworth, which was a name that I had never heard of before. And he turns out to be indeed the single individual who not only had the concept of how to convert light into electricity, but went through the whole process from the late 1920s into the mid 1930s of developing all the technology that became television in the 1940s and 50s.
And it gets more involved because he was also asked to participate in the Manhattan experiment, right?
Yeah.
Manhattan Project.
Yeah. As the story evolves, so we're taught what, to me, one of the things that we overlook in our commonplace acceptance of video, which is now the single most ubiquitous appliance on the planet. But what we kind of overlook is that in the same way the atomic bomb comes from the cosmology that Albert Einstein and his brethren introduced at the beginning of the 20th century, video is a product of that same cosmology. If I were to ask you, do you know what Einstein was awarded the Nobel Prize for?
Give it to me. I've read this though.
Okay,
Because
so
I've seen your interviews.
do you think it was the theory of relativity or E equals MC squared?
Uh,
Pick,
I,
pick one.
I know it was neither.
It was neither. It was it was the photoelectric effect. The very first paper that he wrote in 1905 and it had this long name that I can't rattle off the top of my head now, but it was the articulation of the process by which light becomes electricity when it is focused on certain metals and electrons are thrown off of the metallic surface. That is where we introduce the concept of light being both a wave and a particle. It becomes the cornerstone of all the quantum mechanics that come after it, of which uh, um, the process to the atomic bomb is ultimately a result. But he goes from the photoelectric effect to his other theories and lands on E equals mc squared all over the course of 1905, but it began with the photoelectric effect. So Farnsworth, at a very early age, began to understand what all that cosmology was about. That's what he applies to the problem of converting light into electricity for the purposes of transmitting moving pictures through the air. And in the course of developing the technology which becomes television, he gained more firsthand experience with the quantum forces that people like Einstein and then later Oppenheimer and the people who gathered at Los Alamos, Philo Farnsworth knew more about how those quantum forces work than just about anybody living during that era. And so, as you say, indeed, in 1940 or early in World War II, he was approached by somebody and asked to participate in a secret project in Chicago, which would have been Fermi's pile, the very first nuclear reactor, which was part of the Manhattan Project. And he said to his wife, Pam, I think they're building an atomic bomb and I want no part of it. So he stayed isolated on a farm in Maine throughout World War II.
The irony of this is he didn't want to have anything to do with the atomic bomb because obviously kills people, but he did create TV, which destroys minds. So pick your poison.
Well, okay. I appreciate the irony in the statement, but by the same token, you and I are having this conversation
Right.
and being able to share ideas. So while there is clearly a downside, there is an upside as well. And I
Undeniably.
would then argue as we get farther into the Farnsworth story that he represents the ultimate upside to the processes and forces that they were dealing with in the Manhattan Project, which we have yet to fully realize. And that's the back half of the Farnsworth story, where he was developing a controlled nuclear fusion process.
And this will all tie together at the end because I know you do have a theory
Yeah.
on, whether or not this was used, and it's definitely interesting.
Well,
So
I have a theory of how it could be used. I'm somewhat more reluctant to say that it's already being used because then we're off into really questioning the nature of our reality.
it's all simulation anyway, so it probably
But
happened.
the story that we're talking about here, this was my introduction to all this. I became obsessed with the Farnsworth story when I learned in the summer of 1975, somebody who knew the Farnsworth family told me I knew only that he had been involved in the very earliest stages of television, but I met somebody in the summer of 1975 who knew the Farnsworth family and told me, no, I'm sorry, it was the summer of 73 because I met the family in 75. But in the summer of 73, right after I'd read this magazine, this person that knew the Farnsworth family told me what nuclear fusion is, what it represents for the future of mankind, and that Farnsworth had developed something that seemed to show some promise for that technology. And that was the thing that has always hooked me and kept me interested in that story. Then a couple of years later, when the colleague said, let's make a movie for television about it, we tracked down the Farnsworth family. Long story short, I've known the family since 75. We did try to get a movie for television going about the story, never were able to do that. I deferred to Mrs. Farnsworth after I met her, worked with her on the book that she was developing. She sold me the movie rights before she had ever finished the book. And I never thought about writing a book until many years later, after she had finished her book and that internet business that I was telling you about had been sold and I was no longer involved in it. I was wondering what to do next. And then the opportunity to write my book on that subject came up. And when I finished that book, I figured, okay, I've now found my new career as a biographer of obscure 20th century scientists. What will I do next? And like I sent it out into the universe, and the universe came back and said, "How about this guy?" And this guy was T. Townsend Brown.
And
And
now, one of the really crazy things is this is that you received an anonymous email
yeah,
about him.
yeah,
And I almost wanted to say that Townsend Brown is almost like an illness because once you catch it and start doing your research,
yeah,
it just affects you. Because now I have all these conspiracy theory beliefs.
yeah.
And how did it get started for you? So tell us about this anonymous email.
Well, yeah, yeah. I appreciate your use of the word illness. I prefer to use the word affliction or obsession, and I think in some quarters the idea of being OCD is acceptable. So rather than saying I'm sick, we'll just say that I'm OCD, and this has been my obsession. But as you say, in the summer of 2002, as I was putting the finishing touches on the biography of Philo Farnsworth, which was called The Boy Who Invented Television, I really was wondering at that point. I was kind of at loose ends because I had sold the internet business. I had spent some time working on that book, and I was wondering what I was going to do next. And as I finished that book and enjoyed very much the process of doing that, I did come up with this kind of brand idea that I'm going to be a biographer of obscure 20th century scientists. So I needed another 20th century scientists to research and write about. And then literally, I think it was in June or July of the summer of 2002, as I'm kind of putting the finishing touches on the galleys of the Farnsworth bio, I literally get what I can only describe as an anonymous email. It had a name on it. I have no idea who the name was. Never been able to trace the individual down, but it says for unknown inventors, I think was the subject. And it simply said, another unknown inventor whose work has gone unrecognized was T. Townsend Brown. It said that science said that what he proposed was impossible, but the government classified it. You can see the results of his work in a bluish haze flying over the desert in Nevada. And you can also, and the sharper image also employed his technology in the ionic breeze air purifier. Yeah, and that, yeah. So I did. We had Google. This was 2002. Google was just coming online, so I Googled the subject and I found a website, and the website talked about how Thomas Townsend Brown had pioneered in the science of what he called electrogravitics, which popular culture calls anti-gravity. I think is more correctly called gravity control or inducing artificial gravity, but finding a means of inducing gravity. And because of the nature of his work, it had been associated with the study and curiosity about unidentified flying objects. And it was at that point in my reading and research that I was inclined to get very skeptical because while I don't discount the existence of unidentified flying objects, that has never been a particular obsession of mine. On a basic philosophical level, I don't think we're alone in the universe, but I've never been one of these people who was absolutely obsessed with that particular thing. But this story became sufficiently intriguing and I needed something to do. So I went down the rabbit hole.
And ever since I heard about this story, even down to the email you received, it feels like a game of Clue
Yeah.
because I can't help but associate one of the people that you interviewed for your book must be one of the people that sent the email.
These are the ideas that are all within the realm of possibility. And I have to confess up front that um, well, I ran away from the story for a long time because I was not comfortable with my inability to verify or validate the information that was coming over the transom. And I've always said of this story, or I've said in its latest iteration, that this is a story that lives in the realm. You imagine a Venn diagram, and you got three circles interlocking, and one of them is science, and the other is science fiction, and the third is pseudoscience. And this story lives where those three circles overlap in the Venn diagram. And so I had to rely on sources the veracity of which I was unable to verify. And so the book is written in a way of this is what the sources told me. And in that context, yes, it's possible that because of my interest that the people associated with Townsend Brown thought I might be a good candidate to look into his life and write a book on it.
That is like I said, more of the universe choosing the right vessel to
Yeah.
send the message.
Well, if you've read the book, then you know that the log line, the epigraph that begins the book, the very first thing you read is a quotation that I found very early on in the research phase in the early aughts when I was just diving into this. You may be familiar with the physicist Michio Kaku. He's a popularizer of physics as Neil deGrasse Tyson is, and they're on kind of the same level. Neil's more of an astrophysicist. Michio Kaku is more of a theoretical physicist, but he has a documentary that was on PBS back around 2002, 2004, somewhere in that period. It's called Isaac Newton and Me, and it began with this quotation: "The universe is filled with magical things, patiently waiting for our wits to grow sharper." That I had to research because he didn't cite the source of the quotation in the documentary, but I sourced it to an early science fiction writer who worked primarily between about the 1920s and 1940s, named Eden Philpotts. And that's the quotation that starts the book. And that has been the beacon that I have kept my eye on through the process of telling all these stories. That indeed the universe is filled with magical things, but this particular species has reached a point where we have perhaps reached our limit to what we're mature enough to know.
Yeah, but it does seem like the information is finding its way by who knows what force, but it is getting
Yeah,
out there because
yeah,
we're having this conversation. So that brings me to something that I noticed that was a connection between Philo and between Townsend Brown, and that was Einstein's influence on both of them. Now,
yeah.
what was Einstein's part as it relates to Townsend Brown's work early on?
Einstein himself was looking for what he called the unified field. And I think this is the better answer to your question. So we know over the course of the 19th century, it was determined that electricity and magnetism were the opposite sides of the same force. And they are known as one of the four fundamental forces. The one force is called electromagnetism. Einstein, in a similar way, was looking for a connection between all of the known forces at the time, which, until we began to get deeper into quantum mechanics and discover radioactivity and the strong nuclear force, were simply electricity and gravity. Einstein was trying to find equations that would unify electricity and gravity. And that is what Townsend Brown thought he had done, apart from the theoretical considerations with the devices that he was building in the 1920s and 30s that he called gravitators. He thought he was demonstrating a connection between electricity and gravity.
So he found that link
Yeah,
between gravity and electricity
yeah.
that had been elusive. And it was by accident that he found that, right? How did
It was, yeah, that, 200 years from now, when we look back on all this and accept, um, when Townsend Brown's work has gone through the Schopenhauer gauntlet and gone from ridiculed to opposed to recognized as the truth all along, then they'll go back and look at the way Townsend Brown made his discoveries early on as one of those accidents of science. Brown is in a classroom in MIT, and they're doing something with what's called a Coolidge tube, which is an X-ray tube. And it's a tube that uses a very high voltage. And what Brown notices when the current is applied to the tube, he notices that the cable, applying the current to the tube, the cable itself seems to twitch a little bit when the current is applied. That's what got his attention. And then later he suspended a Coolidge tube in some kind of harness so that when the voltage was applied, he could see that it was generating some kind of thrust. And that became the genesis of his further studies, looking for some means of not necessarily producing a gravitational effect, but a propellant-less form of thrust. And if you turn it vertically, then it's sort of defying gravity without any known visible means of propulsion.
and then once he found this, how did he go about showing this to the world? What was step number two?
Um, Step number two would take us to he did not do well at MIT. He was constrained by the orthodoxy there. He went through the ridicule phase of his ideas. And so he had the means to move around a bit because his family was quite affluent, wealthy. And he went back to Ohio, where he was originally raised, had attended a prep school there that was the prep school for a place called Denison University. And there he went back to Denison. The um, the director of the observatory there was a very high quality academic astronomical observatory there called the Swayze Observatory. And the director of that was a man named Paul Alfred Biefeld, who, according to legend, was at the Zurich Institute at the same time as Einstein. I guess that would be in about the 1890s or thereabouts. So Biefeld's name is sometimes associated with Einstein. But Biefeld held a common interest in the quest for the unified field and was interested in the potential link between electricity and gravity as Brown was. And so the story is that when Brown posed the question, if there is a link between electricity and gravity, what instrument might it resemble? And then Biefeld is reputed to have answered that it would look like a capacitor, which is a device that stores an electric charge.
And now this is birth of the Byfield Brown effect, right?
Yeah, I believe it. Yeah, I think we have 3 or 4 different pronunciations now. I call it the Biefeld Brown effect. I was sitting in on a conference over the weekend where they called it the Biefeld Brown effect. So it's either Biefeld or Byfield or Biefeld or I'm going to call it the Biefeld Brown effect. I like the way that sounds better. But yes, it's the Biefeld Brown effect, and it bears both names in part because it was mostly Brown's ideas and discoveries, but he began to get traction for it when he discussed it with his professor at Denison University, Dr. Paul Alfred Biefeld or Biefeld.
And now this is very important because this is the basis of his, let's say, let's just use the term anti-gravity. So he puts out a publication, Electrogravics, How I Control Gravity.
Right.
And this was basically explaining the Byfield Brown effect, right?
Right. And he describes it at work. He called his devices gravitors or gravitators. So it's a mashup of gravity and capacitor. And they are built on stacks of capacitors that then, when are all stacked together, have this electrically induced propellant or motion effect. And it's described in other circles as an asymmetric capacitor. What we're observing is that in the capacitor, which is two electrodes, electrical plates that are spaced apart by another substance called a dielectric, and I just happen to have here before me two plates from somebody who built a sample of a gravitor back in the late aughts. These are discs of a ceramic material called barium titanate, and that's the kind of material that would separate the electrons in one of these gravitator devices. And the idea was it was an asymmetric capacitor. So you see, one of the plates is much thicker than the other plate, hence the asymmetry. And the basis of Brown's observation was that the negative pole, the negatively charged pole, would move toward the positively charged pole, but the positively charged would move away. So rather than them being pulled together in that context at those voltages, it had this thrust effect. That's the Biefeld-Brown effect.
Once we have this Biefeld-Brown effect, the next phase in his life, I mean, nothing really happens huge with this information. He ends up going to the Navy to continue his work more, right?
He joins the Navy in 1930 and he goes through the basic training. And whether or not this was his intent, he finds his way to the Naval Research Labs, which at the time was the government, the military's primary scientific physics and military research facility. And it's interesting to note, as a sidebar, that what becomes the Manhattan Project as we get into the late 1930s, early 1940s, that project actually had its roots in the Naval Research Labs. And one of the people who is portrayed in the movie Oppenheimer, and I'm forgetting the actor's name who plays him, but the character's name is Vannevar Bush, and he was a very prominent individual in the top ranks of the scientific community during this period, and the scientific advisor to a series of presidents. But it was Bush who was instrumental in taking the Navy's incipient research into nuclear science and moving it into the Army, where it then becomes the Manhattan Project. But Brown goes to work for the Navy during this period, and there are records of the things that he was doing using the Biefeld-Brown effect, and I won't go into the weeds on it. It's in the books, but there is one aspect of it which bears a marked resemblance to the technology which is at the heart of the story of the hunt for Red October. What they call the magneto-hydrodynamic drive is the kind of thing that he was developing using not solid dielectrics, but fluid dielectrics like air and water. So this is where the Brown story begins to get very mysterious.
To me, when I look at it, it seems that this is when he became one of the Men in Black.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because much of his work is hidden behind the Secrecy Act, and he seems to have all these interactions with, the in military industrial complex, some of these larger private corporations, because the Navy does invest into his work early on, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. So they own it from the beginning.
Were you, I don't know what's the extent of your interest in popular science fiction, but were you a fan of the HBO series Westworld?
Oh, yeah.
Okay. So do you remember the critical question that Bernard, who granted turns out to be an android himself later in the series, but he's always asking Dolores this one question that it will be sort of the determining factor in whether or not the androids are achieving sentience. Do you remember what the question was?
It was something about how she feels.
No, it was, do you ever question the nature of your reality?
Wow.
Yeah. So if the androids had the ability to question the nature of their reality, then they were on the edge of the technology inducing sentience in the circuits. As we supposedly have sentience in our neurons. In this case, we're talking about sentience in the circuits. And when we begin to talk about the men in black, and is Townsend Brown, is his story a window into the world behind the curtain? Then the first question you have to ask yourself is, to what extent are you willing to question your reality and accept the possibility that the things that we're talking about are able to be conducted in a way that is completely opaque to the rest of humanity?
And it would seem that this is just the way that the government does business.
Well,
Because,
there is precedent for it. That's called the Manhattan Project. Nobody knew that
right.
an atomic bomb was being developed until Harry Truman announced it in August of 1945.
And then there's also DARPA, all the things that are going on there,
Yeah,
which I
yeah.
think are, and I do make connections between Brown and DARPA, but I'll get to that in a second. But
But
I
before
wanted to
before you do,
touch.
let me just back up and add a little bit to why we are invited to look behind this curtain. And I'll for the sake of our viewers and listeners, I'll share the story of trying to get any information out of the Naval Research Labs about Brown's time there. Now, the expression that I learned from my covert sources, who were sort of leading me through the mine shafts of this rabbit hole, was that his records had been sheep dipped, which was the spook way of saying that the records had been purged and cleaned. Now, when I met Linda Brown in 2003, she brought me a couple of Rubbermaid tubs that had all of the Brown family archives in them. And in those archives, I found correspondence between Townsend Brown and the Naval Research Labs. And some of it's on Townsend Brown letterhead, some of it's on Naval Research Labs letterhead. So I have this documentation. So I filed a Freedom of Information Act request with the Naval Research Labs and simply asked for any or all information that you can provide me about Townsend Brown's service for the Naval Research Labs in the 1930s, in the period from 1933 to 1942. And the first answer I got back was, never heard of the guy. We are unable to find any reference to Townsend Brown anywhere in naval research records. And at the end of this first response, it says, you may appeal this request. The time limit on the appeal, you must provide the documentation. So I made the photocopies of all the documentation and I sent it to the address where I could submit the appeal. And a couple of months later, I'm paraphrasing here, I got the reply back that said, never heard of the guy, don't ask again.
That's the answer. Everything you're thinking, the answer is yes.
Right. Yeah. So the extent to which we can peer behind the curtain and see any glimmers that there's truth to the things that we're talking about extends in no small part to the extent to which you're willing to question the nature of your reality and how much of these advanced technologies already exist somewhere on Earth. Is that what we're seeing in all the reported sightings? Is some unknown force in control of it and trying to bring mankind to a point where we can use it? And then it just raises a lot of metaphysical questions that challenge the imagination, to put it mildly.
Well, I like to look at the observable facts. So if we go back and look at Townsend's experience in the Navy and what happened after the Navy, because he was asked to go investigate what were they called? The Foo Fighters at
Foo
the time,
Fighters. Yeah, right.
the alien or UFOs anomalies that they saw in World War II.
Yeah.
And can you explain how that went down? Because it's almost unbelievable that an untrained, basically a nerd at a desk is going to be doing the things that he was doing. So can you explain what happened?
We come to the period in the closing months of World War II. We're into the fall of 1944, and the Allied forces are sweeping across Western Europe toward Germany, and in the fall of 44, some of the bomber crews begin to observe this unexplainable phenomena in the sky. Now, I don't think the expression UFOs existed yet. That comes a little later. But they observe these balls of light that seem to be under some kind of intelligent control, that have the ability to come toward the aircraft, the bombers that are flying over Germany, fly along with them to some extent, fly around them, fly away from them, fly back. They don't seem to be random. And they are observed on many occasions. I don't know what the actual number is. I don't know if anybody knows. A lot of the response to that was, you didn't see that. But it is a commonly accepted phenomenon that was observed, and for whatever reason was given, again, I speculate in the book the numerous reasons why it was given the name Foo Fighters. And yes, if you're wondering, the band Foo Fighters gets its name from that aerial phenomenon that was observed near the end of World War II. So there is all kinds of legend and lore around what Nazi Germany was experimenting with in the way of advanced aviation and propulsion. We certainly know they were light years ahead of anybody with simple propellant rocketry. And that's one of the stories is they were determined to get to Werner von Braun before the Russians did. And you probably know that he was instrumental in the development of the Saturn rockets that took men to the moon. And then there is speculation that they were involved in other far more esoteric technologies than simply rocketry. So the story is that Brown, where was he located? He's in California, and working still at the Vega aircraft plant in Burbank. And when Franklin Roosevelt dies, and I can never remember, I think it was April 12th, 1945, there is a vacuum in the halls of power, and numerous forces that rush in to fill that vacuum. And in that vacuum, Townsend Brown was asked, or assigned, depending on who you ask, to make the trip to Germany on the surface, to investigate the Foo Fighter phenomenon, to see what he could find out about that. And he was also engaged in some of the other clandestine operations which were at work at the time. One of them was the Alsos program, where American operatives were actively trying to find out where the Germans were in their atomic research and their atomic bomb development. That was the Alsos project. I'm spacing on his name, and it'll come back to me. I'm sorry, but the character, okay, in one case I remember the character's name, in the other case I remember the actor name. The character that Casey Affleck plays in Oppenheimer, he was actually in charge. That general was in charge of the Alsos project, and then came back into America. But so there are a number of research projects scouring the French and German countryside looking for German technologies. And the story is that sometime in April of 1945, Brown parachuted behind enemy lines in Germany and became attached to one of these clandestine research teams, and part of the teams that were searching for German technology in terms of advanced aviation science, and also advanced intelligence and signals intelligence technology.
And so this is where the story becomes a little unbelievable where you have to read between the lines because he was never trained to be a sky jumper. He wasn't airborne
No,
and
no,
he was out of
yeah,
the
yeah.
Navy.
Right. He did have some military training because he had gone through basic training to be in the Navy. But he was not what you would consider. He was by no means a special forces operative.
Right. So
So
here he
that
gets
might have been the
called.
one and only time he jumped out of an airplane.
This is where we have to kind of use our own judgment and say, all right, was he really out of the military? Maybe this is like the movie True Lies. He had another
Yeah, right.
position that we don't know about. He didn't
Yeah,
just
right.
jump
Well,
out with no training.
yeah, and from a low altitude, which makes it all the
Yeah.
more perilous.
And they didn't
Uh,
just choose him to send him to his death. They knew he could get it done.
yeah, yeah,
So you look at that, and then after this, he starts becoming the person that they go to inspect other UFO sightings and crashes.
yeah.
There's another famous one where he has first access to view the materials.
To which materials?
There's another famous crash around that time where
Yeah, now
Townsend Brown is
that's a
spotted.
story that did not there are stories about Brown having access to materials of unknown origin. And I didn't really have direct access to those stories, but I see references to them from time to time. So I'm not able to speak directly to those particular cases. And there I think we're getting more into the 1950s than the 1940s. And there are no detailed records of what his activity was for as long as he was in Europe in 1945.
After this, he now is infatuated with UFOs, right? He starts studying them. He even coins the term aerial phenomena,
Yeah,
right?
that actually, yeah, it's interesting to me that we now come back to the expression aerial phenomena because Brown used that phrase in the 1950s when he formed or was instrumental in the formation of one of the first citizen aerial phenomena research committees. Now we're talking about something that forms around 1955 called NICAP. That's the National Investigations Committee on Aerial Phenomena. Now, I can't tell you with any certainty when the term UFO first entered the vernacular. That's what we're talking about. To me, I find it curious for inexplicable reasons that after years and years of talking about UFOs, they say, no, let's call them aerial phenomena. But that's the expression that Brown used to describe them. And the inference that we're circling here is that to whatever extent he became aware of these aerial phenomena, he wanted to try to identify what technology propelled them and to see what he could maybe fathom that he might be able to like reverse engineer from, and whether it was associated with any of the technologies that he himself had explored in the course of his research into the field that he called electrogravitics.
This now shapes his work because he comes with a theory of how these machines surf the wave. Can you explain
Yeah.
how he said that worked?
Well, um, there's a couple of moving parts there. Um, and it has to do, again, I spoke earlier about the distinction between the fluid dielectric versus the solid dielectric. So he was interested, he never liked to use the expression anti-gravity. He was always curious about what he called stress in dielectrics. That was the phrase that he used. So he was interested in how the phenomena manifest in these dielectric devices. And there are two kinds of dielectrics. There's the fluid dielectric, which is something like air or water, and then there's the solid dielectric. When we started our conversation talking about the ionic breeze air purifier, which uses the Biefeld Brown effect to move air without any moving parts, It's the difference between the size and shape of the capacitors that's moving the air, but the air is the fluid dielectric in that case. So when you're talking about surfing the wave, we're talking, I think, about the fluid dielectric concept, and where it has been speculated to be in use today is in the B-2 bomber. And so there is a fair amount of conjecture and lore on the internet that and it's a big part of some of Nick Cook's book on the subject, that they did in fact use the Biefeld-Brown effect in the B-2 bomber. And so what we're suggesting is that, remember, the basic premise was that in the Biefeld-Brown effect, the negative pole chases the positive pole. The front wing of the bomber is charged positively, and a negative cloud is generated in the exhaust. And there's an apparatus that Brown invented that helped with that process as well. So you have a negative cloud behind chasing the positively charged, and it creates the difference between the negative charge and the positive charge creates this electrostatic wave. And the B-2 bomber is effectively standing on that wave the way a surfboard stands on a wave of water. And the speculation is that the B-2 bomber can fly much more efficiently at very high altitudes, where there's much less air to bite on the curved surface of the airframe, because it has this other effect helping keep it aloft.
And I think one thing to mention about that B-2 bomber that's interesting as well is that it was developed by DARPA with Northrop Grumman. And
Yeah.
did Northrop have any connection to Townsend Brown?
Okay, it's all part of the same, what Eisenhower called the military industrial complex. And the answer to your question is a qualified yes, because Northrop Grumman was primarily instrumental in the development of the B-2 bomber. I'm not sure how we get from Townsend Brown's demonstration for the Rand Corporation in the mid-1960s to that technology being handed off to Northrop Grumman, but that's where the connection is.
I thought I read that Northrop bought Brown's company. So everyone's got to really read your book to get the details on all of this,
Well,
because there's
I
so
will
much
be
of
the
it.
first to admit that I tried to bring, I'm not a trained journalist, but I understand, because I've seen all the President's Men. So I understand the basic precepts of investigative journalism, that you have to have two sources before you can run with a story. And I tried to verify the stories that were being given to me by the covert sources that were helping me unearth all this stuff. But this is not verifiable material. The material has all been sheep dipped. You go to the National Archives, and there's no records of any of this stuff. You file a FOIA request with the Naval Research Labs when you have the documentation of the relationship, and they say, never heard of the guy, don't ask again. And so I'd be the first to admit I reached my limit. And I'd been working on the story for 6 years in 2009, and had written a 500 odd page first draft, just dumping everything I could into it. And then when I went to begin to try to carve out a second draft, I couldn't make sense any of the material. And I ran screaming with my hair on fire out of the room for 13
well,
years.
That's why I want to. You had all your hair at the time. You should say that.
Well, yeah.
Now you look like Larry David and Jerry Seinfeld combined. I don't know how that happened. Okay, but here's now what I want to ask.
I have all their money.
Here's what I want to ask, because you bring up the secrecy about him. I even looked into this. They said just in the year 2010 alone, there were over 5,000 inventions that were held back because of the Invention Secrecy Act, meaning that they were held by the government because they thought they had military application, um, which was obviously applied to Brown's work. Do you feel that he was part of the reason for the secrecy, and he was working for the government, working for these private um, defense contractors, and he's part of the reason why we have the Secrecy Act?
Okay, again, you're the premise to your question, the prologue to your question is, how far do you want to cross that line where we question the nature of our reality? And when I venture far enough across that line to offer an answer to your question, then the answer that I come up with is my speculation that Townsend Brown was the Oppenheimer of the entire realm of Black government research projects. Oppenheimer was focused on the one thing to develop the atomic bomb, and you have kind of the model there for how the government can create a project and keep it a relative secret within the realm of public knowledge. And I would offer the supposition, the hypothesis that Brown was the individual working at that level on a much broader scope of secret government projects. And when you say there are thousands of projects that are withheld because of their potential military or national security applications, I would entertain the hypothesis that there is somebody who governs that whole process. And for some time, I think that could have been Townsend Brown. Yes.
Right? Because it started in 1951. He was working with them in 1951. Maybe he knew the power of what he had was so immense
Yeah.
that it had to be controlled and had to keep under wraps. And I think, to tie this all up, I like that you mentioned how today we call it aerial phenomena again, because
Yeah.
maybe what we're looking at is really just some of the evolution of Townsend Brown's work. And that's why
That's
they're
right.
around military bases. And that's where they go, no, these aren't UFOs.
Yeah.
These are real phenomena. These are ours.
Okay. So when we get to this part of the conversation, I offer three explanations for these phenomena. They are either visitations from elsewhere in the cosmos, or they are our own technologies that are somehow getting out from under wraps, or there's somebody coming from other period. They are ourselves from other places in time. Take your pick.
Now, let's tie this all back to your theory that involves Philo Farnsworth,
Okay.
because to rip a hole or to be able to control time through gravity, you would need really immense power.
Yeah. Well, so you kind of made the jump there from controlling gravity to controlling time. And that's the other connection between general relativity and what Brown was working on. Because when we spoke earlier about uh, gravity being the effect of the curvature in space caused by the presence of large objects like planets and stars, I misspoke, because the way Einstein put it in general relativity, we are talking about the interwoven fabric of the cosmos called space-time. So we're not talking about simply a curvature in space, but we're talking about the curvature in the space-time continuum. And so now we're into an even farther reaching realm of speculation, where if you have the ability to control gravity, you're in theory inducing some kind of artificial curvature. And so if you can curve space, you can also curve time. So we'll come back to that if necessary later. That's where the curiosity about the potential for time travel comes in all of this conversation. But what you're referring to, and where I made the connection and finally decided I had to run with this, because I had the knowledge of these two lost technologies. And we only talked a little bit about the start. About the thing that intrigued me the most when I first learned about Philo Farnsworth, yeah, I was into television and I was experimenting with alternate forms of video production. But when I heard about the nuclear fusion work, that was what got my attention. And I'm sorry I don't have illustrations I can show you, but they're all over the web. He was experimenting with a very, for lack of a better, desktop nuclear fusion. He was talking about a reactor not much larger than a soccer ball that in his imagination would be able to produce megawatts of electricity. There is in nuclear fusion the prospect of something called direct conversion. We're dealing with charged particles here. And if you get enough of those charged particles, and we're talking about billions or trillions of them, they come off as electricity. So this is not the kind of nuclear reactor where you're using the power of the atom the same way we use the power of coal, where you're simply using it as a source of heat to boil water, to create steam, to spin a turbine, to spin a generator, to generate electricity. A fusion reactor has the ability to simply produce electricity. So my ultimate speculation is that that Philo Farnsworth imagined his device that he called the fuser producing megawatts of electricity. And then I make the connection between that and Townsend Brown's gravity control devices because they require extraordinarily high voltages at extremely low amperages. And so my speculation is that what Brown was looking for when he was curious about aerial phenomena was he wanted to know what propelled them. And I am offering the hypothesis that whether those craft are being developed in secrecy by people here on Earth or somebody somewhere else in the cosmos has figured this out, that we are talking about technologies based on the high voltages produced by nuclear fusion to produce an artificial gravity effect in something like Brown's gravitator.
So cool.
That's the connection between these two stories. That is the gift from the universe of magical things that's still waiting for human wits to get sharper before we're really going to give access to it.
If it's out there, we don't know.
Well, the universe
But
has been around for 14 billion years.
somebody's selling
Humans
something.
have walked the earth for 100,000 or so, but it's only in the last 300 years that we have identified any of these magical forces, starting with electricity in the late 18th, early 19th centuries. That led to the discovery of the weak and strong nuclear forces. And I would argue that those explorations kind of reached the limit of the higher power's willingness to share its information with us on August 6, 1945. Because they just saw what we did in Hiroshima and said, okay, if that's what you're going to do with it, that's enough. There's a great line. They're one of my favorite. If you saw the presentation that I did, which I think I can release here in the next couple of weeks, but the presentation that I did for the Cosmic Summit, I keep coming back to Oppenheimer because it's really the most recent broadly popular exploration of what we're talking about here. That force that binds the universe together and mankind's native ability to begin to get a handle at. There's a marvelous scene. This time I remember both of the characters and actors' names, where it's the scene where Oppenheimer is wearing his uniform at Los Alamos because Leslie Groves wants him to wear uniforms and be part of the military. And he's talking to, the actor's name is, I think, David Krumholtz, and he's playing Isidore Rabi, who was another theoretical physicist from this period. And Oppenheimer is recruiting Rabi to come to Los Alamos. And Rabi is saying that Oppenheimer is spread too thin, and Oppenheimer draws on the chalkboard. There's one thing here and one thing here, and here's this, and then there's theoretical here. And that's when Rabi says, you're spread too thin. And Oppenheimer turns to Rabi and says, then you take theoretical. And Rabi takes a long pause. And he takes a seat and he turns and he looks at Oppenheimer, and he says very dramatically, "I'm not coming here, Robert." Oppenheimer pauses and says, "Why not?" And he says, "When you drop a bomb, it lands on the just as well as the unjust. I don't want the culmination of 300 years of physics to be a weapon of mass destruction. I'm offering a different culmination of 300 years of physics and speculating that this species, these apes with nukes, have got to get past what's holding us back before the higher intelligence governing our presence in the universe is going to let that out from under wraps."
What a great message. And I think that's the best place to end it on. Thank you so much for sharing. Like I said, I love this story. Both the stories are great. I'm gonna go back and read the Philo
Yeah.
book now, but everybody should go get the the man who controlled
The
gravity.
man who
Sorry, I'll
mastered
put
gravity.
there you go.
Well, we'll start with the boy who invented television, and then the man who mastered gravity. And I'll wrap up by saying that what is compelling about these stories is that there are dimensions of them that, regardless of my inability to verify the sources, these are real people who did real things, and some of their work remains with us. The most obvious manifestation of which is the fact that you and I are talking to each other right now through a video screen. And everything that we're talking about started with the technology and the cosmology that gave us video.
Yeah.
That's undeniable. Whatever else you want to say about all this off the wall speculative stuff, the video is real and it started in the same place.
Yeah. It's all magic.
Yeah, it is. It's
All
a
right.
universe of magical things. Thank you, Eden Philpotts.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much,
All right.
Paul. Really appreciated
Hey, it's been
this.
great talking to you.